In many instances, historical narratives have been crafted from a singular perspective, often overlooking the nuanced experiences of marginalized communities. Joining us is author Michael Harriot, whose book highlights the significance of revisiting history through the lens of the Black perspective. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I do want to ask, you have a very diverse background. You're a political commentator, acclaimed columnist. What led you to undertaking a project like this book?
Well, I was always known for including historical perspectives in my writing, and on social media I talk about history a lot because I was partially homeschooled. So I only recently realized how much of whitewashed history people learn, partly because like when my children were going through elementary school. And so when I proposed a different book, all of the publishers were like, but what about the history thing you do? And so this book came about, and we flipped the order because the other book, the subtitle, they said no one knew about, and it was about a little known subject then called critical race theory. And they said nobody wants to read about that. And so we did the history book first.
Okay, so you kind of gave a broad, explanation, the unwhitewashed story of America. What does this book all entail?
So it is the story of America. We always learn about history through a white lens. And then we learn about Black history sometimes through the perspective of Black people. But this story is about American history through the perspective of Black people. And it looks different and it sounds different, and there's a lot of information that you don't know. For instance, when you talk about 1860, right? Well, to Black people in America, especially those who were enslaved, it was just two people who were running for presidents. Like, they didn't care about that. But what was going on in their lives and what their lives looked like, what their political reality looked like, was totally different from like Abraham Lincoln in a presidential debate. And that's the stuff we talk about in this book.
How long did the research take you?
It took about 2 years, just the writing part.
Wow. And now what would you say was your biggest challenge in trying to, accumulate all of this information?
Well, one of the biggest challenges was just the research part, and the fact that there's two sentences that I kept running into because I wanted to include not perspectives of Black people now, right? But what Black people were thinking then. And I look for old Black newspapers, journals, and in many cases I'd run into the same two sentences, especially when it relates to Black newspapers. Burned by a white mob, no surviving copies exist. And so one of the things that you run into is just how much of Black history has been destroyed over the years.
Yeah, and now I do want to ask you, is there any lesser known event or figure that holds significance to you that you talk about in this book?
Well, the absolute favorite of everyone who reads this book is a man from the Low Country named Forrest Joe. Forrest Joe led a band of what they called Maroons back in 1821, and for 3 years he had the Low Country basically up in arms because he was an escaped slave who had a band of rebels who were stealing from farms, and eventually ran onto the governor's plantation and shot at a slave supervisor in broad daylight. And he was the most wanted man in the country at the time. To catch Forrest Joe, they formed a committee, and that committee was the first police force in America.
Wow, I've never heard that before, but that seems like something that we should know and that we should talk about.
Right.
So Michael, do you have any advice for people who are looking to incorporate more diverse perspectives into whether it's their studies or their professions?
Yeah, I think one of the things that this book focuses on, and what we all should focus on, is when we learn stuff, we should wonder whose perspective we're talking from, right? So when we're talking about, for instance, enslavement, right? We often give the white perspective, like the slaves were treated well, and so we should often wonder about the perspective of Black people. For instance, in South Carolina, because the population was majority Black for most of its existence, you have to wonder what kind of system could be so violent that it would suppress revolts for all of those years. It had to be some kind of way to instill that fear and violence. And that perspective is rarely included when we learn about South Carolina. Most people don't know that South Carolina, for most of its existence, from the 1600s until today, was majority black.
Well, that's what we can gain from reading this book, Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America by Michael Harriot. We will put the website on the screen where people can go and get their own copy. Michael, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
We're back with more Fox 24 News Now.